subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hi, welcome to Elonomics. We are barely 3 weeks from the general budget. And this budget, more than any others in recent years, is supposed to be critical for reviving growth in the Indian economy. But there is also a concern developing over growing consumer price inflation. What impact will this rising consumer price inflation have on the budget and the kind of policies or the announcements the government wants to make? We have Professor Ela Patnaik here who will talk to us about that. Hi Ela. We are barely 3 weeks from the budget announcement and there is also inflation going up. So is there a worry about that for you?
Not particularly. I think the increase in inflation is transient and that inflation will go away. This is because the inflation is mainly in vegetables. You know, and even in the last 5-6 years, when inflation has been within target, then also, so around 4%, that's our target. Then also there were episodes when we saw some increase in vegetable price inflation. Now in November, I think the inflation went up above 35%, vegetable price inflation. Now what happens with vegetable prices is that the cycle is very short, about 3 to 4 months. You know, you from sowing to the harvest, and if prices go up, then there is a supply response. And usually it's not that vegetable prices keep on increasing, because what is high priced increases supply and that price often comes down. So I'm not particularly worried that this inflation is going to be permanent and is going to stay. I think that there's been a big spike. So it's now in December, CPI inflation went up to about 5.5%. And if it had been permanent, if it had been in core inflation, which means without the vegetable prices, then I would have worried. Even the Monetary Policy Committee would have, maybe not just put interest rate cuts on hold, but it could have hiked interest rates, because what you don't want is a permanent increase in inflation and inflationary expectations. So the current scenario, because of the fact that it is due to vegetable prices, because of the fact that we have seen such inflation before going up and then coming down, is not expected to be permanent, but is expected to be transient.
But one is vegetable prices, but also the contribution of milk, because milk prices have been recently increased and they've gone up by 2 to 3 rupees per litre. And this fear of petrol and diesel prices because of what's happening in the Middle East. Are you sure that we can be confident that this is transitory?
See, nobody can ever be confident of the future, right? But if we analyze core inflation, which is what we look at when we make policies for the future, which is that we remove the volatile elements. Now, if milk prices have gone up by 2 rupees or even 10 rupees, then are we expecting that every month they'll keep going up? Because if they keep going up every month, that is inflation. Yeah. If they go up once
and then stay there,
then it's a price rise, one-time price rise, and that's not inflation. Okay? So unless we think that there is going to be something that is going to cause them to keep increasing continuously, we don't expect it to keep going up. Now, even if now we look at the core inflation numbers, they are below 4%. They have not gone above 4%. And central banks usually look at core inflation when they are trying to decide policy rates, because these rates are usually going to have an impact a few quarters down the road. About 3, 4, 5, 6 quarters later, you expect to see an impact, not immediately. And by then, if it's vegetable price inflation, it's usually gone away. It's usually gone away. So that's really the scenario on where one might expect inflation to be. Another very important aspect of this is demand conditions. Now, an inflationary scenario where inflation is high or expected to persist or expected to grow up is one where demand is high. Currently, we have a scenario where demand is low, where demand is falling. Investment and consumption demand are both declining. that is typically not an inflationary scenario. So I'm just broadly saying on expectation, the probability of vegetable price inflation turning into something persistent is low.
So explain to us the connection between the inflation numbers, whether it's CPI or wholesale price index numbers, and how that can constrain policymakers when they're formulating the budget, especially in a scenario where we have to revive growth.
Yeah, you see, there are mainly two things that macroeconomists would look at in today's scenario for making the budget. The first would be, is there, what's the GDP growth rate, and is there a need to revive demand? That's the first thing. And there, I think there's broad agreement. GDP growth rate is now estimated to be 5% for this year, and that there is a decline in investment and consumption. So boosting demand would have been something that economists would have said we all agree upon. But the second question that macroeconomists would look at in this situation is, what is the fiscal deficit? Currently, the fiscal deficit is already above target. In fact, the official numbers may be showing an underestimation of the actual fiscal deficit. Usually, the concern is that if you have a high fiscal deficit and you to push up demand, you do an expansion. And expansion means that you borrow more. Fiscal expansion can be done by borrowing more through, and then either spending more or because you cut taxes. So it can be anyway. But a fiscal expansion would today expand the fiscal deficit. And if we are already at deficit levels that are higher than what we were targeting, maybe higher than what we are showing, then we could fall into a debt trap. Our interest payments, which are already a large part of the budget, in nearly half, they eat up nearly half the budget. They would expand even further. Your debt may not be sustainable. Remember that debt sustainability means that that government debt grows at a rate slower than GDP growth. Otherwise, if your government debt is going faster and GDP is growing slower, then your debt to GDP ratio increases, and at some point it stops being sustainable. So, these would be the two considerations. One is, do you need to push up demand? And the second, is your level of debt sustainable? And here, why inflation is a consideration, a third, a very important consideration, is that when there is inflationary pressure, a fiscal deficit fiscal expansion would also add to the inflationary pressure and could push up inflation.
So you're saying that there should be no reason for the government to be worried about going through with an expansionary budget?
See, I'm saying that if the fiscal, if inflation had been a permanent sort of increase in inflation, the government should have worried. But because this is a transitory inflation, it's transient, it's vegetable prices, it's likely to go away. So, within this setup, inflation should not be the primary worry. There should be other worries. In fact, one worry would be whether your debt is going to be sustainable or not. Is the government going to borrow too much? We are not a country that has done very sensible fiscal policy. We've not run surpluses when times are good. We've then also run deficits. So one needs other institutions in place. One needs a fiscal council that looks at what is the government doing. Are the numbers correct? Is there adequate transparency in the numbers that the government is putting out? One also needs a public debt management agency that assesses how much the government should borrow and when. And one needs, most importantly, a bond market, because that's what gives a signal to the government. When the government borrows too much, then the bond market tells the government, hey, I'm not going to lend you so much at this price. Right. And that is necessary for that whole mechanism to work properly. You can borrow more, but then you better have those institutions in place, because otherwise you run the risk of not having a sustainable level of debt. So inflation should not be the main concern this time. You can have expansionary fiscal policy, but with the expansionary fiscal policy, set up a fiscal council, set up a public debt management agency, undertake bond market reforms.
So the steps are very clear. You should not be worried. The government should not be worried about going through with an expansionary fiscal policy. But there are also other measures which ELA talks about. Please keep watching Elanomics, especially this month as we go into the countdown for the budget in the next 3 weeks. We will come back to you with a fresh episode next week, and do subscribe to the Prince YouTube channel. Thank you.